You're listening to an event from the U.S. Institute of Peace, part of the USIP podcast network. For more information about our work around the world, visit usip.org and check us out on social media.
All right, this is the last plenary of the day, and it is going to be very lively. Challenging my colleagues here. No, it really is going to be, and it's going to be very engaging with you, the audience. This is called Key Takeaways, Gaps and Priorities for Research, Policy, and Practice to End Conflict-Related Sexual Violence. And so we are very lucky and honored to welcome back to the U.S. Institute of Peace. I think the last time you gave a speech here, it was in 2015 on feminist foreign policy. Remember that? Anyway, so I am very pleased to welcome to the podium here Margot Wallström. She's the former UN Special Rep on sexual violence and conflict, and she's also the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sweden. She is a friend to all. She has taken up the issue of CRSV in a way that is global and persistent. That's what I think of you, Margot. Persistence in all your leadership. Thank you for coming back. Thank you for joining us for these 2 days. The floor is yours, and then we'll invite your panel up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I would like to start by saying warm thanks to Kathleen and her team. We have come together in very dark times. That's almost banal to say that we live in perilous times. But you are providing a safe spot for us here, a safe place. We have made and found old and new friends here, and kindness, a common goal, and also very constructive ideas. And that means something. This is so important in those days that we can be. So thank you so much, Kathleen, and your team that you're having us here. I think we should give her and the USIP and Lise, of course, an applause. I will encourage throughout people to do applause. I like that. I think we can move around a little. So this is, of course, what an opportunity to make sure that during this particular session that we can take stock. We can discuss what did we learn during these first 2 days. There is another day tomorrow, of course, but what will we take away from here? And I will soon present the panel, and I will ask them if they can maybe give us a to-do list. I'm fond of to-do lists. So what would their short or longer to-do lists from now on, what would it look like? My own to-do list, and I will just say a few words about that. Of course, justice is at the core of this. We are still fighting impunity for these types of crimes. And as I said yesterday, we are in the different situations that we have, like in Ethiopia or other countries around the world. Women are still not there. They are not invited, and it means that impunity for these types of crimes can continue. So the whole judicial process to define what justice is, also in a broader aspect, has been in one of the previous session was about that, and I think that this is definitely something that we will have to continue to work on. I would say more money in the hands of women. more money in the hands of women. And could you believe it? Robina, am I pronouncing your name right? Robina said that $50 meant a lot to women, where she comes from, where she's active. Meanwhile, the world spends more than $2 trillion on militarization. $2 trillion go to buying more weapons or modernize the weaponry that we have. And I truly believe in also smaller projects like the one we've heard of. And if you put more money in the hands of women, we know that we'll go to feeding children or building sustainable societies. So that is one point on my to-do list. I believe also that technology, that we should be able to use more technology, modern technology, to protect women in different situations. When they are refugees, when they are internally displaced, everybody these days have a mobile phone. Why can't we use it to make sure that we keep women safer and that we use the best of technology? If we have sort of alarm or a special number that you can call if you need help or just for information and what have you, we have not done enough to make sure that we use modern technology. And these days you can, of course, via satellite, you can find one person on this planet. So we ought to do more. I haven't seen many good ideas about this, but I hope that will come. And I insist on us being able to measure results. I think it is so important to describe also the successes that we've had, and the fact that during, let's say, the last 15 years, more has been done on these issues and the issue of conflict-related sexual violence than under the previous history of mankind. So already we should also measure some of this and value some of these results. That's very, very important. I was asked by a newspaper to write something about, and this will be kind of more political, but I think that we are meeting not in a vacuum. We are meeting in a situation and in a dire situation for this world. And we have to understand what that means. You can hear that I have such a bad cold, so we'll see if we can manage. So I was asked to make a forecast for next year. And I wrote the following. Let's see if I can read it here. I think that 2024 will bring anxiety and anger. Anxiety over the existential threats, climate change and water shortage, and we know that affects women first and foremost. Wars and nuclear weapons. The geopolitical challenges and changes so profound that they make us feel the tectonic plates move. Anger over growing inequalities, lousy governance and leadership, corruption, and thereby failing democracies. And when we are talking about women, they make up half of the world's population. This is a matter of democracy as well. If they cannot participate, the world spends more on militarization than on dealing with climate change. So the outlook is bleak. Has to be. But do we have to go over the cliff shouting whoopee? Women all over the world have seen their rights being taken away or restricted in many countries. Be it basic human rights like education, health care, the right to decide over their own bodies, or being listened to. And in Latin America, as we've heard, women are being killed. So many women are being killed that it is being called femicide. Sexual violence is a global scourge that, despite nice words in resolutions, continue to destroy lives. I believe that the coming year will mean make it or break it for women in Afghanistan and Iran. The massive oppression has to stop. It cannot continue. Because women fight. In Ukraine, the Middle East, in Africa, and everywhere, women fight. They carry children, food, responsibilities. They protect, they protest, and take the lead, making up half of the world's population and wanting to be defined and treated as more than victims. I place my hope for next year, for 2024, in women. When they are seated around the negotiating tables, being elected to political posts, leading companies, families, or organizations, battling injustice and sexual violence, more options and perspectives are brought to bear. Democracy functions better when women are proportionately represented, and women's participation should not be a novelty, but normalcy. And to say something about hope, because that is also important. And you remember that there is a beautiful poem by Emily Dickinson, and she says, "Hope is that thing with feathers that perches in your soul and sings a tune without the words and never stops at all." All right, so let me make that just an introduction, a little bit sort of overall political, but I think we need to put ourselves in a bigger picture as well when we also talk about conflict-related sexual violence. I want to invite my panelists to the scene. Please. And excuse me for being such a, coughing. So, just look at these fantastic people on the scene, and maybe I don't have to present them. You have seen them around, but I will still mention their names, and maybe you will see it also on the screen. We have Dr. Mayesha, who is the Vice President of Research, Foreign Policy Analytics. We have Victor Madrigal Borloz, Eleanor Roosevelt Senior Visiting Researcher from Harvard Law School. We have Natalie Smith, head of the Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict Initiative team from the UK. Nadine Tunasi, manager, Survivors Speak Out, Freedom from Torture. And she's also from the United Kingdom Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict Initiative. And of course, Ambassador Melanne Verveer. She has been presented previously as well. She's a tireless fighter for women's rights. So I was thinking I would like to invite you to just give a short, we'll take the first round, and I'll ask you to just give a short to-do list. What do you think you will be taking away from our 2 days or 3 days, as it will be, here at the US Institute of Peace? So where do we start? Maybe I'll go this way. Please.
Okay, I get to start again. Okay, thank you. So I do have a do list. Obviously, I've been listening a lot, and I'm really grateful for the conversation and really the richness of the subject. I've written my point down, and the first thing I'd like to talk about as a do list or key takeaway on the research is that obviously in the concurrent conversation, there was a lot of issue with consent from survivor and the way we seek survivor to engage in consent when we are researching. about their experiences, about what has happened. And I think that we need to work harder. We heard it over and over, how we need to develop consent forms that do not only protect the researcher, but also ensure that the organization responsible is held into account should there be anything, or should anything happen to the survivor. I know a lot of people mention how confidentiality is already mentioned, but it's not enough. We just need to have really the researcher held accountable. That way, it's more balanced. And also, one key note on that is that we've noticed that quite often this research questionnaire, many survivors who have taken part in those conversations have mentioned how the questionnaire were very long, and they found it very hard to engage with survivors, and the questions were quite technical, and then we needed to have questionnaires that were easy to understand and did not have so many jargons. That way, survivors who were participating were not so overwhelmed. So really, we need to involve survivors in the designing of those questionnaires, and really involve survivors from the initial, planning of those ones. And this is really, stay in my heart, a point made about local researchers taking the feedback, into account. We need to ensure that the local researchers who are working on the ground in conflict zone are listened to when they are feeding back to the donors. Somebody mentioned how they were told they had no right to question the World Health Organization, and I found it very appalling, because I do think they have the reality on the ground, and they should be able to contribute and really share. We need to actually respect the funding, and perhaps really redesign the way they are able to input. And I'm going to steal that phrase. Someone mentioned that you cannot kill a snake with a long stick. I still remember that. So really, I think the shorter stick would do a better job. And we don't have enough representation of survivors with physical impairment, and I think this was also crucial. We've heard a lot of things, but I think that we need to make sure that the issue of all survivors are well represented, and we address the multi-challenges, and also taking into account the context, in which survivors have experienced sexual violence. On policy, we do have a challenge, with conflict-related sexual violence being visible. And really, personally, I do appreciate all the international and local effort, the involvement of all the stakeholders. However, we need those policies really to punish rape as a serious crime. We need to strengthen the international legal framework so that survivors can see perpetrator held accountable properly for the crime. And I think you mentioned earlier on that justice is still a big issue. I've noticed that we had a lot of conversation. We have multidisciplinary discussion here, but I'm from the DRC. My country has been in conflict for a long time, and we know that the businesses, the mining industry is also really contributing to this problem, but they have not taken part in this conversation. We need them to understand the impact sexual violence has on victims, and I think the best way is really to have them on this forum and really understand what is going on. I think I should stop there for now. Thank you.
So, what did that say? So we just continue. All right, thank you.
Thanks. And thanks very much, Nadine, for that. So yes, Margot, thank you. As you say, I'm head of the PSVI team in the UK, but I'm basically a month into that role. So I wanted to start with some humility, that I'm very conscious that I'm surrounded by people with really, really deep expertise from their experience, from their academic, from their policy-making work, and also start with some gratitude to USIP and everyone here, because I think it's just been the most extraordinary 2 days so far of learning and sharing, and the kind of depth of conversation, and the commitment to work together on this has really been invaluable. But with that said, I mean, perhaps with my kind of somewhat fresh perspective, I thought I'd reflect what my kind of top 3 takeaways from the discussion, and therefore, without presuming to give a to-do to anyone else, what am I taking away from that in terms of, as the UK government, kind of what we should be doing? And so for the first of those kind of three takeaways, I wanted to go back to the framing of the very first plenary around the sense that CRSV is not inevitable. And I think that kind of North Star, I suppose, in how we're framing and approaching things felt to me kind of something really important. And although preventing CRSV, it's the kind of really tricky and complicated issue, looking at social norms, understanding the difference between different contexts and perpetrators and what that means. This is really, really not easy work. But I think what I would take away from that for my to-do is really commitment to kind of looking at that difficult prevention question in everything we're doing, and kind of not shying away from it, I suppose. And then the second kind of takeaway for me is really around the importance of being genuinely, meaningfully, fully survivor-centred in everything that we're doing. And I think it's been so heartening through this whole conversation that I think there's been absolute unanimity on the importance of having survivors at the centre of the conversation. And I really go back to, I think, Kolbasia's point in the first plenary, which was around the question isn't what do policymakers want, it's what do survivors need. But I think although there's that consensus, actually getting into the detail of, okay, well, what do we mean by being survivor-centred? There have been so many really important panel discussions on that over these last 2 days, making sure that it's not a buzzword, but is something, that's genuinely meaningful. And again, for PSVI, it's something that I think we've been on a learning journey on. We're really committed to, but we know there's more we have to continue to improve, with the leadership of Nadine and Kolbasia as our survivor champions and our survivor advisory group, many of whom are here today. But I think the to-do is to continue to learn on that, to listen to the perspectives and the insights. And then very quickly, finally, I think my takeaway has just been the value in having this conversation, bringing people from different spheres and disciplines together, from research, from policy, from practice. But also within those disciplines, I think speaking just as a bureaucrat, it's so easy to be, you're in the peace and justice lane, or you're in the humanitarian lane, or the gender lane, or the rights lane, and we don't often enough come together and think about how actually all of these pieces are so critical. And so spaces like this, to have the opportunity to connect informally, are really important. But I think for me, I also want to take away, how do we as PSVI, continue to use our systems and our structures to make sure that we're really kind of bringing all those perspectives and voices together in everything that we're doing. Thanks.
Thank you. So we go on.
Sure. Thank you, Margot. And first, I just want to say thank you to Kathleen and the USIP team for bringing us together for these important days of discussions. I remember vividly being here 10 years ago when Missing Peace was launched and participating in that. And it's the work that you've done over that decade. And also for me, it's a real personal privilege and honor to be here with some of my own professional and intellectual heroes, including Ambassador Milan Verveer and Professor Elizabeth Wood, who you heard from yesterday. So maybe just 2 or 3 things to answer your question, Margot. The first thing that comes to mind, and reflecting on Ambassador Geeta Rao Gupta's call to action yesterday during her speech, which is ultimately, if you're talking about preventing and ending conflict-related sexual violence, what you have to get at the heart of is preventing, resolving, and overcoming conflict. That is the business that we are in, and we need to not lose sight of that, because hopefully in 10 years, Kathleen, you will bring us back together, and we will have made a tremendous amount of progress, but that can only happen if we have moved into new ways of resolving and preventing conflict. And that means investing in mediation and investing in peace building, and making sure that throughout those processes, CRSV is always integrated. And from that, it takes me to the issue of transitional justice. And there have been some really rich discussions on that over the course of the last couple of days. And transitional justice is my first love. My first book was on transitional justice now 10 years ago. And when I think about where that field has come in the last couple of decades, I think one of the things that's really important, and we've heard over and over again here, is our understanding, our conceptualization, not just theoretical, but practical, of transitional justice, and justice in particular, has to be broadened. Somebody said in one of the sessions over the course of yesterday that more and more transitional justice takes place in the absence of transition. And so what does that mean for conflict-related sexual violence? Well, what it means at a minimum is that reparations must be part of how we think about addressing CRSV. And that includes everything from medical care, for immediate injuries and long-term morbidities, whether that's fistulas or otherwise. That means psychosocial support for survivors, again, in the immediate and continuing basis when we know that those legacies live for decades on. And also viable and sustainable livelihoods that help survivors overcome precarity with purpose. And so if we're going to think about justice as beyond outside of the courtroom, what does that look like? Well, reparations have to be front and center for that. And then the third thing I would say in response to your question and reflecting on what hasn't been discussed, I think, adequately in the last couple of days, at least where I've been able to participate, is how does CRSV fit into and with the digital domain? And in particular, two things I would mention. First, and this is especially for those who are working with organizations like PHR or the International Criminal Court or ICRC, in other words, which is the digital preservation of evidence in the age of hybrid warfare and as cyber operations increasingly intersect with kinetic warfare. When you are documenting and collecting sensitive data, how are you protecting that from things like ransomware attacks and otherwise that can not only re-traumatize survivors of CRSV, but expose them to all kinds of new risks? And relatedly, and this came up a little bit, but I think to your point about a to-do list, when we are living in the age of emerging AI and AI-generated misinformation and disinformation, what kind of risks does that create for addressing conflict-related sexual violence? I was here just a few months ago for a conversation that USIP had convened with Bintu Keita, who is the Assistant Secretary General and head of the largest peacekeeping operation in the world, MONUSCO, and she was talking about how even in her mission and for the protection of civilians mandate, including addressing CRSV, threats in the digital domain are making it so much harder to do that work. So I think that's definitely, where our field needs to focus more deliberately. So I'll pause there with those three things, but thank you.
Thank you. So there we got a new topic for sure to put with AI. Victor, you tried to say that you needed more time being a Latin man, but we are very
successful.
tough. We are very tough. So your turn.
I'll try to be as succinct as I can. Well, and of course, thank the U.S. Institute of Peace for this invitation. It's a great honor for me to be here. So my task for the to-do list, the first one I think is the exercise that I myself have tried to do during these 2 days. I come to this conversation having done 10 years in the field of sexual orientation, gender identity, and having prepared my second last report to the General Assembly on conflict-based violence and discrimination affecting persons on those bases. And I actually find that there is a significant point of connection between the findings that report actually led me to formulate, including, of course, the frailties in data collection systems that not only have frailties because of their inherent design, which in very many cases doesn't take into account the way people define themselves, and the way in which they self-identify across the world, but also in the frailties that Mayesha was describing, which is the risks that they create, not only because of the technological possibilities, but because of the political volatility of the topics that we work in. It was very often in my time as independent expert that the day after an election, I would get a call from a human rights organization working in a difficult country saying, the next thing that they've told us is that they're going to come and get our computers. The police is going to come and seize the computers with the data that we have there. And of course, some of my friends in Washington or in Geneva said, well, why don't they put everything in the cloud? And I said, well, the reality is they usually don't have electricity a number of hours a day, so this is not a very viable option. The second thing that I wanted to mention is that I believe that there is a significant pending task in developing research on what the systemic causes that enable and perpetuate stigma are. And I'm interested in speaking about legislation that actually enables the policing of sexuality and actually restricts bodily autonomy. I think that these are great enablers of sexual violence. And of course, within that context, in a very specific way, I'm interested in looking at criminalizing legislation on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. That impacts, of course, gay men in the case of homosexuality, but perhaps it's less known that 44 countries criminalize same-sex intimacy between women. And of course, these are enablers and perpetuate the possibility of sexual violence during conflict. The third task is cross-referencing with my previous work on the torture rehabilitation field, where I had the honor of working with Freedom from Torture and other organizations, and this notion of the victim-centered approach. And this actually has a lot to do with power. Power of the victims and survivors over their own stories, and the way that their stories are used, the way that the data is actually destined, and things as basic as the ability to be forgotten, which of course in the Eurospace is taken for granted, but nowhere else actually exists in informed consent processes. I also think that it's particularly important to listen to the calls for legal and psychosocial support. Grace was mentioning this quite specifically. And I also think that if we're going to be looking at victim-centered approaches, understanding where it is that we need to go beyond the binary is an important task. Because not only do terminologies such as LGBT not necessarily correspond with the way that people identify under, but this impacts, of course, the way in which people self-identify in much wider spaces. So I think that this is an important job to take. Finally, my last report to the General Assembly, which was only presented last week, actually lays out an agenda of decolonization, which I think is quite fundamental. And I just want to give 3 keywords in relation to this. Is decolonization of policy and legal frameworks, which of course are perpetuating gender policing. It's also the decolonization of terminologies and definitions of identities and the way people occupy public space. And I think quite importantly is the decolonization of knowledge frameworks. Ali was mentioning yesterday the difficulty in epistemic exclusion of researchers from the Global South and the devaluing of knowledge that doesn't follow neatly the axis of valuation that are defined in those terms. My call, carrying out this work, was for an inclusive reading of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which I think it's possible. And I think that this can take us very deep into not only the inclusion, but also the deconstruction of some of these asymmetries of power that are truly supported by these preconceptions of gender, of course. So that's a little bit the call that I would make.
Thank you. You see, we are opening sort of door after door, or door behind door, to understand better what...
And many doors, because this journey goes on, and I feel no matter how much we have done, there is still so much more to do. And I think it's particularly fitting, and I want to say this, that Margot Wallström is here today on the invitation of USIP, because She not only is the mother of the feminist foreign policy and the former foreign minister who is deeply committed to these issues, but she was the first SRSG on conflict-related sexual violence. So you belong here, Margot. I'm going to come at this, and I have lots of things on my to-do list, but for this first round, in no particular order, I really come at this from the policy point of view, because I feel that whether it's in the governmental settings or in the multilateral settings, there is a lot of work that goes on in terms of policy development and resolution passing. And yet, as we said in the last panel, a lot of this is never truly implemented as it needs to be. I often say that we don't need another resolution to 1325. We've got to implement those 10 resolutions that we have, which we're far from doing at this point. So one way of looking at it is the people who are engaged, particularly at a very high diplomatic decision-making level, say in any of the governments in the foreign ministries, are often grappling with issues, like in places that all of you know, that are places of severe conflict today, with a CRSV component to them. And yet, in doing Ukraine or Myanmar or Sudan or whatever, that is not part of what they work on in finding the solutions to those conflicts. And we've got to find a way to more holistically ensure that people who are in those very positions understand all of the tools and all of the challenges that they have to address in a coherent way. And similarly at the UN, you know, we watch very carefully and follow and try to engage in the Security Council debates on the critical areas of conflict. And yet, despite the resolutions, despite what the UN stands for example, a resolution on Tigray can barely mention conflict-related sexual violence when it was so central to what was going on there. So we have severe challenges in this area, and I think I mention them because they really are important to the eventual outcomes. And I'll tell you a quick story. When I first started in the State Department as ambassador, not long after that, I was called to testify before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And the issue on the table was, why is the United States not addressing conflict-related sexual violence? There happened to be a female chair of the subcommittee who was asking this question. When we know when women go for firewood or when they go for water that they're absolutely vulnerable. Why can't we protect them? And I, tried to make all of the promises I could, feeling passionately about this issue. And I went back to the department and asked for a meeting that would pull in many of the offices that really had engagement on this issue. And the meeting started with the desk officer for the DRC, and Nadine, I hate to tell you the truth, saying, I don't know what women have to do with this issue, why we're even here discussing it. And I thought, we are really a far away from where we need to be. Now, I hope that that's improved dramatically from those days, but it has said a lot to me about the need for training of our officials, but also the need for them to fundamentally understand how they cannot be effective in their jobs unless they address issues like this. Another area are the tools, and there are so many tools in the toolbox, many of which have been discussed over the last 2 days. I will mention one because it's also an area where research policy impact comes together. We at the Georgetown Institute did a study on sanctions that the UN has for areas in conflict. There are 8 sanction regimes as at the time of the study. And some of them mention conflict-related sexual violence. Some of them do not, but conflict-related sexual violence is a big part of why the sanctions regime was developed, because of the conflict going on in those countries. And what it is a tool to get at some of the leaders in ways that personally affect them. And in fact, the United States in the last year has also adopted sanctions to deal with CRSV. But the question is, again, the implementation. I know that Treasury, in terms of the United States, just not too long ago raised sanctions on two of the leaders in Sudan. But again, it's a tool. We make much of the tools, and I think we really have to work at ensuring that when they're announced, that there is more to it than the announcement. I was very moved in the last session during the discussion on trafficking. I've worked on trafficking for more years than I can count. And as Siobhan was speaking, I was going through a reel in my head of all of the discussions on trafficking. Horrible problem, affects women and men and children, but predominantly women. Some of it is for economic, in economic ways, domestic servitude. Some of it is sexual violence, etc. But it is always divorced from a conversation like this. The human rights part rarely comes up, and institutionally, it is in the UNODC, which is the organization of the UN that deals with drugs and crime. It's a problem. It's a huge criminal problem. There are criminal networks behind this in a big way. But the amount of trafficking that goes on in conflict-affected areas, it's almost a beaten path on the part of these criminal networks who see the opportunities, in their view, of women that they can get at because they're so impacted by the conflict. We've got to do a better job of bringing these two areas together. Just very quickly, I have a long list, but I'll just say one more and then we can do another round. But engaging men has come up in this conference, and there are various ways to do that. But men, and thank you, Victor, have to be a real part of the solution here. And having Natalie on the panel reminds me of the former Foreign Secretary of the UK, Mr. Hague, who put this issue as his priority issue in the Foreign Ministry. That's where PSVI came from, initiated by a male Foreign Secretary. And others would say to me, oh my gosh, we're in these meetings, G7 meetings or G20 meetings, and he's always raising CRSV. Yes, with good reason, but we need more of that to really move forward. So I'll end there.
Thank you. Thank you all, and I definitely believe that the whole issue of sanctions is an important one. I remember more than 10 years ago when I started that we talked about how to design sanctions that would be really effective, like preventing people from having cattle. You know, that there were other types of sanctions that would have been more effective locally or nationally. So I think you have added also to that. But I think also what you've said is that leadership means something. Leadership on these issues, that somebody dares to bring it to the fore, as William Hague did, and so on. Now, I think we should take a few questions, and then we can have a second round. And I want to do it this way, that I will ask, you can ask a question, and then you can direct it to, well, all of them or one of the panelists, and then you will get a quick reply, and then we take another one. And so we don't collect several questions, but make it a little quicker so more people can ask questions. So do you want to put a question to, yes? The microphone will arrive.
Hi, my name is Margot, and I am a co-founder and president of United Women of the Horn. We are an organization that is trying to get more women from the Horn of Africa into politics, into leadership, so that we're part of negotiations and peace processes. First, I'd like to say thank you so much to both of you for talking about Tigray. I'm Tigrayan, I'm sorry I didn't mention that. We are a group of women that are forgotten a lot, and so I'm really grateful that you guys have both continued to mention Tigray over and over again throughout both days. But today I was able to attend the panel on disabilities, and it was very powerful, very, very, very powerful, and very moving. She was one of the panelists, and I was incredibly disappointed by the lack of attendance. There was maybe under 10 of us, and so I really wanted to make that comment. It really left an impact on me, and I wish we were talking more about disabilities. This is not an area that I work in, but I feel that we should be talking about it a lot. And so I just really wanted to make that comment and really want to say thank you, and I'm grateful for being here. Thank you.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Do you want to comment on that, one of you, or?
Well, I'll just say that you were right to be wanting to underscore that, because this is an area that doesn't get the attention it deserves, and I think it was terrific that the USIP put it on the agenda. Hopefully more and more governments are going to be responsive. I mean, it's terrible to go to places and hear, this is a person with disabilities, he has no future, right, because of the way they are dispensed with once they have that disability. And any of us can be disabled in an hour if we cross the street and get hit. But this lack of sensitivity and this deprivation of human dignity, and then bring in conflict-related sexual violence on top of that, we really do have to pay more attention. So thank you for raising it.
Thank you. And Victor?
Thank you. Just to echo the thanks, and perhaps to add one element of information that to me has been I've learned a lot from my colleague, the UN Special Rapporteur of Persons Living with Disabilities, and the intersection of our mandates was something that we actually worked a lot on. And I wonder, and this is just a question that I ask myself and that I will be reflecting on, to what extent is this I know your comment was specifically in relation to a session, but I am going to go to the larger context of understanding sexual violence that impacts persons living with disabilities. And I wonder to what extent the lack of data that I've discussed with Gerald Quinn, my colleague, also relates to the compounded stigma that persons living with disability face when relating in a social context to their own sexuality, because it's very often that the sexuality of persons living with disability is denied. And therefore, I wonder to what extent this also impacts the possibility of having data gathering points and research points in relation to this issue. I'm very proud that 5 days ago, Gerald and I issued a joint statement on the human rights of persons living with disability who are LGBT, and hopefully 2 of the recommendations of the 9 that we issue actually impact that existence of research and knowledge, also impacting sexual violence against persons living with disabilities.
Thank you very much. I wonder if there is another aspect of what you just said also when it comes to these negotiations and mediations. Have you invited some of these big negotiation or mediation organizations to discuss? Because it seems that they are not very good at introducing the topic of conflict-related sexual violence in their mediation efforts or negotiation efforts. And I think they need to know better what this is about. So maybe that's another big meeting here. Please.
I would also like to make a comment. I remember, perhaps pick up the point about Tigray. I remember when the conflict started in Tigray, there was a survivor from Tigray who reached out to us, Kobasi and I, to join a campaign. And I know at the time I had it as a do list, and I'm glad I have an opportunity to talk about it again. which was, I know that at the time Tigray wasn't amongst the key focus country for the Preventing Sexual Violence Initiative, but we raised that with the PSVI team, and I know that the UK government was able to send an expert on the ground. So one of my actually do lists was really, in order to prevent sexual violence, we have to have a mechanism, prevention that really allow us to respond quickly when sexual violence occurs in a country that is not listed as a key priority. And also I think for the Survivor Advisory Group, I'm really so grateful being here at this conference. And I think Obasi and I can talk about it with Natalie, how we can be more inclusive in the Survivor Advisory Group and really try to have a survivor, representation from that group. Thank you.
I wanted to just bring in one additional point to your comment about persons with disabilities, which is certainly, yes, the targeting of individuals within conflict zones who have disabilities already at the onset and then being targeted with sexual violence is incredibly important, as my fellow panelists have highlighted. But I think the other thing that's really important, and part of what I was trying to allude to earlier, is when sexual violence that's committed during a conflict leaves a person with disabilities, and as I mentioned earlier, whether that's fistulas, whether that's sexualized torture with weapons and otherwise, the importance of understanding that long impact and how that affects the rest of their lives, and to integrate that better into this agenda and these conversations, I think is really important. For example, in my work with Elizabeth Wood on the Rohingya crisis, this is something that we didn't look at with a disability lens, and that's our shortcoming. But one of the things we did pay very close attention to was how women who were targeted with sexual violence, including pregnant women, young women, elderly women, the ways in which they experience mutilation and other forms of deliberate ways to leave them physically impaired, and not just unable to have children, but also not be able to flee or not be able to have any kind of safety long term. And that's just one context I allude to. And so thank you for your point, but also I agree completely that the bringing in the disability lens to this agenda is really important as well.
Thank you. I think I saw somebody waving up there. Yes, you, sir.
Merci beaucoup. Ce n'est pas une question, mais je voulais juste ajouter un petit commentaire par rapport aux survivants avec handicap. Au fait, ce qui est intéressant, c'est que ce sont des gens qui sont affectés dans deux situations. Ils sont plus prédominants dans les conditions de violence en temps de paix et aussi en temps de guerre. Ils sont plus importants en temps de paix et aussi en temps de guerre. Donc, il faut qu'on attire une attention particulière à ces gens pour essayer un peu, n'est-ce pas, de bien venir en aide et avoir une bonne conduite à tenir. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. He was saying that you have to understand that people with disabilities are affected both in peacetime and in wartime, so it adds a special. Yeah, I saw there.
Thank you. My name is Bina Nepram, and I'm with U.S. Institute of Peace. I'm also the founder of the Manipur Women Gun Survivors Network. I really agree with Dr. Mayesha. We recently saw how acts of sexual violence in conflict were actually filmed and circulated and made viral. And this happened to women of Manipur, where I come from, which resulted in re-traumatization of what happened to them months ago. And with no end in sight for these survivors, that's why digital and technology impact of what happens to us, women, people, must be taken into consideration. Number two, the whole question of, Ambassador have also mentioned in terms of how transnational organized crimes. I did a lot of research on gun running, narco trafficking. These are the same roots of women trafficking, human trafficking too. And sexual violence in these conflict areas have also happened, which results in my final point of there are many conflicts that we are studying today in this conference pass. There are 26 known conflicts in the world which are reported every day, but there are 300 more unreported conflicts in the world where sexual violence of women happens every single day. My point to the panelists is, what are we going to do about this forgotten crisis? And Victor, your last point on decolonization. Decolonization, a lot of this work is done by indigenous communities. So again, my request to be more inclusive, I would like to hear what indigenous women leaders have to say about responding to this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Very important and relevant questions. A difficult question as well. Does anybody want to come in? Or
Bina, you've done such amazing work on bringing the situation in Manipur to public attention. It's a horrible, horrible conflict that's been going on that the government has not really addressed or under martial law. It's, just talk to her. It's unbelievably difficult and trying. But the point you made, that incident that took place not too long ago, of the violence to the women in Manipur, that was sent out around the world on social media with great pride on the part of the perpetrators, what they had done, exacerbating the problem beyond the horrors that it represented in and of itself, should focus us all on how we deal with the social media phenomena, as Mayesha pointed out, because it's this problem. It's also women in politics today. Political violence is occurring in spades on social media. There are so many consequences. Admittedly, there's the good side, but we really do have to address this adverse side. And I think to raise it in this context on CRSV is really important to do.
Okay, so Victor and then Nadine.
Just to thank, of course, the comment in relation to decolonization and, of course, the intervention of communities, and in particular, of course, of indigenous peoples in relation to this work. A very quick note of what could be and hopefully will be a long discussion. What my report aimed to do was to actually bring a contribution to the reasoning as to why the challenging of legislative and public policy frameworks is firmly grounded in United Nations objectives, and particularly Article 73 of the Charter, which of course it's a connection that I was hoping to have as a contribution, but in the process of creating that report, I received hundreds of submissions from indigenous peoples, from people representing ancestral identities, that actually just made the case that what we would qualify today as gender inclusive frameworks has been the rule in recorded history. And so I think the point in relation to this is to tap into that diversity in a non-extractive way, but rather in a participative way, to understand exactly what kind of democratization, dismantling of structures that are not useful from human rights approaches is exactly what I think you're alluding to, that participation that in my view is an essential part of a human rights-based approach, right? Participation, empowerment, accountability, and non-discrimination are the 4 pillars.
A couple of more comments to this, and then we'll have a last question, and then we will run off.
Well, just very briefly to pick up on, and thank you for the point around technology, and to thank Mayesha for raising that initially. I think, this is a very difficult new complexity, not only through social media, but then the circulation of disinformation on social media, of threats. I think this is a really complicated topic for us to get into. But without wanting to be too optimistic, I think there's also opportunities around the digital and technology space for the CRSV agenda. And I just before this panel was downstairs in the virtual reality scene, looking at the Yazidi context, and it's unbelievably powerful, and you think you understand a little bit about the context, but it really brought it home. So really to advertise that if people haven't gone, and we're also as PSVI working with the International Criminal Court with virtual reality at the moment, trying to kind of use that technology to help witnesses and survivors to understand in real terms exactly what that experience would be like. So I think there are some opportunities there, and I think there's much more to understand. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Bina, for your comments, and both about Manipur in particular, but also forgotten crises in the world. And, it reminds me, when I was formerly Ambassador Revere's deputy at the Institute, we had a journalist scholar come as a visiting fellow, and it culminated a book called Mother, Where is My Country, which, if you haven't read, is fantastic, and it covers many of the forgotten conflicts in India, and including in that region. But one of the points that's really important in that book, and I don't think we've talked enough about over the course of the last couple of days, is when policies are incredibly destructive and they enable conflict-related sexual violence and impunity for those. I am not an expert on India, but I know enough about AFSPA to know what destructive impacts that's had on protection of civilians and on women during armed conflicts, and also in enabling sexual violence. And I think, for us, all of us, to be paying attention to policies that are enacted, including by democratic governments, that perpetuate or enable the perpetuation of conflict-related sexual violence is incredibly important.
Thank you. One last question.
My name is Helene Duque. I'm from the University of Antwerp, and I have a question for all of the panel. But it was something that Dr. Alam brought up, the promise of reparations, which several people have mentioned. And my research is about the former Yugoslavia, and I've looked at the reparations process in Croatia and Kosovo, and then you see that this is really dependent on political will. It came far too late after the conflict. And then you also see that it involves a difficult process whereby kind of new hierarchies of victims are created because it advantages certain victims over others, not the ones that belong to the enemy group, things like that. There's also discussions about the budget, of course, and then also the question of how to prove that you have actually been a victim, for which people then need to come to a commission where they have to tell their story again and kind of give proof. So there are also people who do not get the reparations because they are not believed or because they don't have the proof. So I wonder whether that is actually the answer, because we seem to be very hopeful, but I don't know if that is really the case. So I would like to hear what the other panelists think about that.
That's an excellent question. I think we will make a final round. So we start here again. Do you want to say something?
Okay. I don't think I'm able to answer that, but I may touch on my final comment. Obviously, for the past days, I've heard a lot about transitional justice. I just wanted to really highlight that whilst it's important to bring a nation to reconcile, sexual violence really destroys a nation, divide community. I think for me, one keynote is also considering that when we are offering or discussing transitional justice, we need to make sure it's survivor-centered. It needs to be a person choice to really take that route. And also involve survivor in, all survivor, including children born of war, in the peace negotiation. I'm really sorry, I couldn't answer that. So
thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, yes, very, very quick final comment from me as well that, links a little bit, but I think related to that, and more generally, I think something I've taken away from the full 2 days is just around the importance of context, the importance of recognizing the kind of heterogeneity of the experience of different survivors, of different perpetrators, and related as well to what that means in terms of redress and other areas. And I think there's been a number of really valuable, important conversations on intersectionality in that context, and I'll be taking that away from today.
Yeah, I think because your comment was or question was in response to some comments I made. I think, to be clear, I wasn't suggesting that is a one-size-fits-all approach, right? So you mentioned ICTY and sort of the former Balkans, and I worked on the residual mechanism there, and I'm not suggesting that what works there works in Kenya TJRC, where I also worked and works in, name it, special courts and so on. I think it's really important to, as I said, broaden our understanding of justice and make sure that in addition to punitive and retributive measures, we're keeping reparative and restorative measures in check and helping survivors ultimately move forward with their lives. I will tell you as a final comment, I was working at the UN in 2008 when Security Council Resolution 1820 was adopted, which was the first ever resolution to deal with conflict-related sexual violence. And I was inside the Security Council when that debate took place and then the vote happened. And it's easy to lose track of how much progress we have made in the last almost 16 years since then. And especially when we are looking for transformation, it's easy to lose sight of incremental progress. But incremental progress, and including on transitional justice, is important and must be built on. And so I would just encourage that as we work together, we also take the long view.
And hopefully I can build on that aspect that you were making in relation to not one size fits all. Rosa Maria made a really good point in one of the panels about trying to keep always an open understanding of what justice means for the survivor or victim. And I think that what the challenge that we have, and I say this having instructed a number of cases when I was head of litigation at the Inter-American Commission, is that understanding changes. In justice processes at international level, at least in the regional system, when you have a survivor or victim having gone through a process that is 10, 12 years long, it might be that at the beginning expectations were some, then in the middle they will change, and then towards the end they will change. I had the harrowing experience as head of litigation to actually talk to victims that would say to me, I've forgotten the reason why I'm here. And, seeing that, the system was having the expectation that this case would be emblematic for non-repetition, and then having to say, well, you have the absolute right of actually saying you don't want to go on. So I think that just having that possibility, having that understanding, and of course having the system have these points of inflection where there are certain absolutes, and that's why I mentioned before, the ownership of the victim, of the survivor, of their story. And the reason why I keep on saying that is because I've seen far too many times that ownership is lost, and that pressures are exercised with good intention, but with disastrous results. So I would say, just answering to Rosa Maria's call to ensure that we keep an understanding of what victims and survivors believe justice is for them at a particular point in time is crucial.
And I think, obviously, keeping our attention always on the survivor. I had a really emotional experience not that long ago in Bosnia, where a woman was attending an event I was at, and the organizer said to me, she would like to speak to you. Could you spend a minute or so with her? So when I talked to her, her eyes were sort of looking down, and she clearly was uncomfortable. But she wanted to tell me what she told me, which was that she had been raped during the war, which was now 20 plus years ago, and that she has no peace, and that she has a hard time living with herself because her perpetrator is the policeman on the corner in her neighborhood who is viewed as an upright, admirable human being. Something is not right with this picture, and both on the side of accountability, on the side of what she is owed and the price he should pay. But this is this is the story throughout much of Bosnia and throughout other parts of the world. In Kosovo, on the other hand, as you know, in recent years, they've really tried to do something about reparations, and they have come up with a monetary sort of a quasi-pension that could go to women who were violated. But as you said, it's very difficult for the women who testify because they relive what happened to them. And there are times when they're not viewed as being honest in terms of their situation, and so they don't get the reparations that they deserve. So while there's a real effort in Kosovo, and I admire them for what they're trying to do, it's not perfect, as none of these solutions seem to be. And then I think of what Dr. Mukwege said to me. He said, you know, the women who suffer from CRSV suffer terribly, and they want to heal. And he said, the thing they tell me most is they want to return to normalcy. They want a market. They want to be who they are again, not what happened to them. And how do we put together a reparation that is satisfactory to what those women say to him? And he sees the worst every single day. So it's a complicated issue, but there are people who are caught up in this issue who deserve something better than I think we're able to provide so far in so many places.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all our panelists, and another round of applause to these amazing people.
Thank you for listening to this event. If you'd like to listen to more events or explore our other podcasts, visit usip.org/podcasts.